Well, hi there, everyone. Is anyone there? That's great to know. Well, I gotta say, we have a powerhouse panel right now of powerful women, as the name implies. And today we're talking about 25 years of disrupting the status quo. And beside me are women who've been doing just that. I want to introduce them, starting with former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Please join me in welcoming her. We're also joined by Ruchira Gupta. She's a journalist and anti-trafficking activist and author, as well as Oumie Sissokho, co-founder of the Girls Agenda. Feel free to wave so they know who you are. Bronagh Hinds, Peacebuilder at Northern Ireland, and Maria Pacheco, founder of Wakami Global. Thank you all for being here. So, Secretary Clinton, I do want to begin with you, and I want to start broadly because you are no stranger to disrupting the status quo. I can think of a few times you've done that. First woman to be senator in New York, first woman to get a presidential nomination from a major U.S. party, just to name a few things. So I wonder, for those in the audience who maybe haven't done as much as you have, that wasn't meant to be shady. What do you say to those women who are advocating for women's rights today? And also, which women's rights do you feel are most at threat?
It's a great question, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to be back at Vital Voices and to be on a panel with women whom I admire and know, women I've worked with in the past, and be part of this extraordinary network. You know, it is a broad question, but let me answer it in this way. I think that the gains that we have seen in women's rights and women's opportunities have been significant. I remember very well in 1995 when I was at Beijing at the UN Conference on Women, we passed a platform for action, which I'm afraid in today's world would probably not pass because it had to be unanimous because it was the United Nations. So every country had to sign on. And at the time we passed that, there were hundreds of millions of girls not in school. There was inadequate health care. There were economic barriers to the participation of women in the economies of their countries. There were laws that prevented women from inheriting property, from opening a business, all kinds of prohibitions. Women in some places were not allowed to vote, drive a car. Women were, in many parts of the world, really kept down and kept back. So fast forward all these years later, certainly progress has been made. A lot of laws have been changed. A lot of doors have been either opened or knocked down. A lot of women have assumed positions of leadership and responsibility in the public, the private, the not-for-profit sectors. So a lot of movement has happened since the world really came together and had an honest assessment of where women stood. However, in the last few years, some of it driven by COVID, which disrupted so much of our lives, there have been a lot of setbacks to women's ongoing progress. And to just name a few, after combating child marriage in Africa, it went back up during COVID. After criminalizing domestic violence and creating laws against it and special programs to shelter women or to punish offenders, it also went back up during COVID. We saw the maternal mortality rate in the United States of America go up after making a lot of progress on women's health. We obviously saw the reversal of Roe v. Wade and the imposition of very draconian laws about reproductive health and abortion in the United States, just in place after place, to say nothing also about the wars that have gone on. And, you know, we thought, again, we were making progress on the conflict front, too. And in places now, like Ukraine, like Sudan, rape is a tactic of war, going after women, particularly women who are outspoken, stand up to oppression. And so, as with any time in human history, there's good news and bad news. And part of our challenge with Vital Voices is to keep pushing forward. Because in some places, it's the very survival of women, the right to survive. In other places, it is the right to have an education all the way through as far as they want to go. In other places, it is having the opportunity to pursue a dream, a job, a business that is still difficult. So it's hard to pick out sort of one thing that needs emphasis. You know, I wrote an article about a year or so ago in The Atlantic where I said, you know, women's rights are now understood to be legitimate and to be an important achievement to continue to pursue. But without power, women's rights are very fragile. And so we need to keep not only talking about rights, but talking about empowering women to make the decisions that are best for them in their families, their communities, their societies. And that's what we keep doing.
Yeah. And Secretary, I want to spend a moment focused here in the U.S. Obviously, it's an area you've worked extensively in, and you mentioned the Dobbs decision, which rolled back Roe v. Wade. Are these rollbacks inevitable? I know the Supreme Court has been a big focus right now with Clarence Thomas. Do there need to be ethics? Do you believe the Supreme Court should have a code of ethics?
I do believe that. Why should they be the only institution in the United States without a code of ethics that is enforceable? The lower courts, the circuit courts, the Congress, people who run for political office, and they have a lifetime appointment. So I'm old enough to remember that there was a Supreme Court justice back in the 1960s appointed by President Johnson, who, it was discovered, had engaged in some financial dealings with a friend, a colleague of his outside of the court, and was forced to resign. So, of course, I think there should be ethical standards, and they should carry some weight, because the daily revelations about what has gone on, particularly with Justice Thomas, but a few others as well, and it should be nonpartisan, not just bipartisan, nonpartisan. There should be a set of standards, and people should be held to them. But I just want to close by saying that I mentioned power, and it still remains the most important power, which is to cast your vote for people who you think will protect your rights. And too many people in our country have failed to believe that or accept that, thinking there's no difference. Well, now we've got one really big difference, and it's the Dobbs decision, and it's the kind of draconian measures that are being passed in a number of states that are right out of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. I mean, you can't even imagine the United States in 2023 and the kind of, almost punitive measures that are being put on women's lives and choices.
Thank you. And I want to bring you in, Bronagh Hinds, because you've done some really important work overseas. I'm thinking of Northern Ireland. You actually played an integral role in that intractable conflict, first by introducing a women's coalition to help resolve it. For the Gen Z in the room, she essentially helped craft the Good Friday Agreement, and actually last month marked 30 years since that civil war passed. So with all of that said, I want to know and get your perspective. Can you speak to coalition building right now? How important is that in the work of women's equity?
It's absolutely essential. And just to start with where Secretary Clinton started, talking about the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995, that was the very first international delegation of Northern Ireland women, and we collaborated together. I remember booking the air tickets, don't tell anybody, with no money in the bank, because we had to get them at the lowest prices, and we had to raise the money, the first delegation of women, to go to a massive conference where women's rights are human rights. But we started way back in the 1970s. Women leaders of the civil rights movement, women starting a parallel women's rights movement, not just waiting for civil rights, but actually working on women's rights. Setting up the first women's centre, out of that spinning women's education projects, other women's centres on both sides of the divide who could then work and collaborate together. And I know with your friend and our friend Ines McCormick and others, women in the labour movement, rape crisis centres, many work, and not just in urban areas, but in rural areas. We are very rich in Northern Ireland in civil society and women's activism. And I suppose if you come to the time of the Women's Coalition, and I want to quote a colleague of mine, Annie Campbell, she said, "The audacity of men thinking that they could sit around the table and decide the future of Northern Ireland without women present." And the women's platform, the Women's European Platform, had been lobbying and arguing for this and challenging parties over a very long time. But there was another reason. Because we wanted the war to end. Because we had seen that previous negotiations with primarily only men around the table had not yielded results. And indeed, when we put out that call to women, because we had years of working as women together and forming collaborations, yes, falling out over feminism, over this issue, over that issue, falling back in, knowing how to trust each other over the many years, and setting our hearts and our minds on a very important goal. Actually, the second part, I have to be careful when I'm doing this internationally, because I'm very aware if I'm working with our friends, in Syria or areas which have not had a long history of civil society, they think, can we not do this? And of course, we can start at any time, and lots of things can be the mobilising force. But I find in the conflict, the most mobilising force is that women have been dealing with the effects on the ground of the children and in the communities, and the mobilising force is to work for peace and then to actually create the opportunity, find the opportunity, or seize the opportunity. And it was all of that we did in those days. But there was something very different that women brought to the table, which I think it's important to talk about. When you go in, and Secretary Clinton talked about it in terms of power, when we're in the negotiations, the political parties, the men in the political parties are focused on the power, who's going to have the power, is it going to be shared, what are the institutions going to be? The men with guns are focused, as we all are, on the security issues, okay? And we as women brought additional issues. We could cope with all those issues and be pathfinders in some solutions, but actually bring additional issues that speak to the future of society. Now, why was that? Because, and I've also seen it in Colombia, because we didn't go in with a zero-sum position. We said, how are we going to lead our position? And we focused on that point that you made about ethics, based on values and principles. And our core values and principles were around equity, human rights, and inclusion of all stakeholders, and being at the table, including people at the table, and going through the dialogue, no matter how difficult it was. And I leave you with one thought. Had women not been at the table, it is inconceivable, and I know we were the first women in a peace negotiations, victims and survivors would not have been mentioned in the agreement. And I was asked over lunch, what would I do now? What did we not get right? And it's what I say when I'm working with women elsewhere. When you think you're asking for something that the other parties aren't asking for, multiply it by 100, double it, multiply it by 10 again, because we as women are not asking for enough.
No, that's so powerful. Because women don't just bring themselves to the table, they bring so many others. And also hearing you talk about coalition does not mean we're just getting along. It means we're willing to work through. I do want to turn back to Secretary Clinton briefly here, though, because you said something that struck me, and it was that the men thought they could make decisions without us at the table. And of course, we've been talking about 2024. It's looking like we might have a rematch between President Biden, former President Donald Trump. Is an 80-year-old white man disrupting the status quo as a potential Democratic nominee representing that party?
Well, I think as president, he has disrupted the status quo. And now he has a record that he's running on. And, you know, I was in the Senate for 8 years. And so I have a real understanding of how difficult it was to get accomplished, to get past the legislation that he did. And that legislation, whether it's building, you know, roads and ports and airports and broadband and all the rest of it, or whether it is building the manufacturing of the future with the so-called CHIPS bill, or clean energy, will employ millions and millions of Americans. So the economic investments that are being made because of President Biden's very singular focus on helping us to have the economy of the future is really disruptive. Because, you know, the prior president, he who shall remain nameless, he must have said the word infrastructure 1 million times. Infrastructure, you know. Never did a thing about it. Because it was hard, you know? So talk is cheap, action is valuable. That, to me, is disruptive because we're currently in a period in our country's history where we think we can't get stuff done because nobody will listen and nobody will talk and nobody will compromise and nobody will stay and actually, you know,
do we see that changing?
Work. Well, I think Joe Biden has proven it. I mean, I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves from the press or, you know, maybe some large segments of the people, but literally, he got a lot done in 2 years in very difficult circumstances, including an insurrection at the Capitol to try to prevent him from being president. That is disruptive in the best sense of the word. That is, you know, I know that it's not easy. I know that, you know, a lot of folks didn't vote for me. I know that some people were literally trying to prevent me from being president. I'm going to get up every day, no matter my age, and we're going to get stuff done. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. Oumie, I want to bring you in, and I'm so glad you're representing the African diaspora, specifically West Africa, the Gambia. Yeah, I think that deserves a round of applause. And I understand in your advocacy work, you take a very specific approach, specifically when it comes to shifting social norms in your work for women and girls. Can you just break that down for us, first of all, and then talk about how do you go about shifting mindsets and attitudes? I think we can fall into the trap of groupthink. I'm just talking to people who agree with me, but you do the opposite.
Thank you very much. Oumie herself is disruptive in nature since at birth. I came from a tribe where the firstborn is expected to be a male. And here came a girl. And I grew up in a situation where I saw my mom being battered, and I had no idea why. I started talking about freedom, justice, equality, when I didn't know the meaning of feminism. Okay. When I didn't know the meaning of feminism. I would crack conversations at school, junior school, with peers and ask about their family settings, if this is something normal. It's something emotional, and I still battle with it. But here I am today, a woman who was battered, having a child, a daughter, who is now a globally recognized activist for women and girls in the Gambia and beyond. I used my mom's experience as a woman of faith, a woman with limited words, a woman of grace, and I worked very hard, attaining myself a university degree by myself when the chances were very slim. In my tribe, the first menstruation is actually the ticket for graduation if a girl is lucky to be in school. I escaped that. It was disruptive, but it came to haunt me when I was 25, and I was graduating with my first degree in the Gambia as the best graduating degree holder in political science and heading to Thailand for a study exchange program. I was seen as too disruptive by my father's extended family. And an unknown man was brought from nowhere. I actually haven't still set my eyes on this unknown man, and I was told to be prepared for a marriage. And I was like, I have co-founded my own organization with my best friend, moving all around the Gambia, speaking to women, mothers and fathers to send their daughters to school. Well, again, this is another slap on my face, but it is not happening. I headed to Thailand, and I told my father, I will send you back to your extended family and tell them that this survivor is not going to be intimidated anymore. It's enough, and I am not going to marry this unknown man. Those extended family members who were pushing the agenda never contributed to my life or to my well-being when I was struggling with my mom as a single mother and my maternal grandmother. I emerged out of that, headed to Thailand, came back and got a scholarship through the Taiwanese government, went to Asia, and it became an issue. I was too much a traveling girl. I was too much a loose girl. The tribe wasn't happy, but they couldn't do much about it because I kept reminding them that you didn't contribute a dime to my well-being, to my education. It is that woman who is silent, who should get the credit about me, but you're not letting her. I moved on, and I focused and invested my energy, my resources, and my time on the girls' agenda, especially from 2015 to date. Almost every government institution in the Gambia, in 2015, when I came from Thailand, I actually wanted to visit them and talk to them about investing on girls' education, their health, and their well-being, using my story as a success story. In the Gambia, I am a household name because of the approach that I take, talking to parents, mentoring children, convincing guardians to send their daughters to school. I use friendly community approaches by using my story as an example that we could actually disrupt the harmful social norms that are affecting the progress of every girl and woman in this country. I will go to communities and speak to community leaders. I will go to community radios and speak to the people. I will speak to my people, bringing myself down to the level that we will understand each other, but making a point that no woman or girl deserves to be disrespected. We all have our equal rights, and we are to be protected, respected, and we should ensure as a society to always promote the well-being of every girl and woman, because if we do, our society will progress. I also continue working with organizations like Vital Voices, I must acknowledge. Giving me this space actually is very disruptive in the global donor community. Young women like myself were not accessing resources. We were not accessing platforms like this. We were not talking to BBC or CNN, sending information out that affect the well-being of girls and young women in our countries. So having a link with Vital Voices, for example, gave me a platform to access Global Fund for Women. That also gave me a platform to access Amplify Change, for example. And we are producing videos talking about sexual violence, talking about domestic violence. These are taboo topics, but we are now using arts. As someone mentioned earlier in the day, we can talk about anything using arts. We become the actors and the actresses ourselves. Go to the media, play dramas, play theaters, create the movies that our people will understand. Talking about female genital mutilation, talking about sexual abuse, talking about building girls' leadership. And I am glad to say that over the past 3 years, my organization has produced 600 girl leaders in the Gambia through support that we got from Global Fund for Women. And that support was built through my participation with Vital Voices. Today, as I am seated here, I came with my 2 daughters, Chilel and Jabu will not be mutilated. So your investment for the past 25 years is the product like me, who have decided that my daughters will not be cut like me, and I am using my story of not mutilating my girls to convince my community and my tribe that girls deserve better. Girls deserve leadership. Girls deserve life skills. Girls deserve entrepreneurship skills. Girls deserve information about their reproductive health and their reproductive rights to be protected and to earn an education and not to be caught in the name of culture.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. For those online, there's some standing happening in the crowd. And you said your daughters are here. I think I've seen them. Maybe they can give a wave too, though I think they're very small. You mentioned storytelling, and of course that makes me want to turn to you, Ruchira. In my reading of your work, you've been described as a feminist storyteller who wants to paint hope. For those unfamiliar, you actually had a debut fiction novel last month, so congratulations. Oh, look at that. I Kick and Fly. And I know a lot of your work is centered around human trafficking and preventing that, but why use storytelling, whether through the form of journalism or fiction, to do that? And how can those in the room who maybe do storytelling in their work disrupt through the stories they tell?
Thank you. First of all, I'm just thrilled to be in this room with someone I've admired for such a long time and met again and again at very critical moments. And I just want to give an example of my own life, how storytelling has helped me make a difference in the world that we inhabit today. I was a 20-something kid, and I went to listen to Hillary in Beijing. And I was standing in the rain, and someone gave me an umbrella and said, we can share this umbrella. And then a few years later, I was trekking in the hills of Nepal, just a year later. And I came across rows of villages with missing girls. And I couldn't understand where all the girls were, and I decided to ask the men sitting there and drinking tea, playing cards, and they said all the girls are in Bombay. And I followed the trail and found little girls locked up in small rooms for years, being exploited by multiple men. And as a journalist, as a woman, as someone who'd been to Beijing and seen the unity of women's action and the words that women's rights are human rights, I couldn't believe how this could exist. So I wanted to do something. I decided to tell the story. And I ended up making a documentary called The Selling of Innocence. And that documentary, I won an Emmy for that documentary. And I came to New York, and I was looking at the bright lights and lots of applause. And all I could see were the eyes of the mothers who had told their story in my documentary because they wanted to save their daughters from the same destiny. And Donna Shalala had given me the award. I already had contact with Mrs. Clinton, and they put me in touch with Swanee and Malan. And together there was an instant women's circle who said, you want to make a difference? We are going to help you. And they took me to speak in front of the UN and show the documentary there, and to the US Congress. We created a bipartisan bill, Wellstone and Brownback. And today I can say I played a part with the help of a few friends, and one of them is on stage, who galvanized all this action in the UN Protocol to End Trafficking in Persons, which is now the golden standard for all the countries to change their laws, 160 countries, and part in the passage of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, the first anti-trafficking law in the United States. And literally, it was the circle of vital voices, which I want to acknowledge. And I want to tell that story because very often when we do the work, we forget the work that our fellow women have helped us do. And then, of course, I went back and set up an NGO to help the girls who the mothers wanted to protect. And again, there was lots of danger. There was patriarchy, men will be men, prostitution is as old as the hills, nothing can be done. And I was trying to get the girls into school and facing a lot of challenges. And I remember Mrs. Clinton came to Calcutta. And even before she went to meet the chief minister in Calcutta, she came to visit our NGO. And I just gave her a photograph of her with a girl practicing karate. And that literally is the essence of my book, I Kick and I Fly, which I've just signed for her, in which a girl, 14 years old, from a nomadic tribe in India, escapes the sex trade by becoming a kung fu champ. And that's why it's called I Kick and I Fly. And the reason, again, I've gone back to storytelling is because I think we have to break the silence around issues which affect our children, but we don't talk to them about. So this book is a young adult's book published by Scholastic. And it's going to trigger a conversation which we need to have because sex trafficking is happening to children our age. But also in schools across America, CDC has just brought out a report which says that teen mental health is a big issue, and the root causes are body shaming, bullying, sexual abuse, food insecurity, homelessness, the same things that I talk about. So this book might be a message in a bottle, but also it's a way of passing the baton on to the next generation. And I'm back again with Vital Voices and with the same group of people to do so. So I'm so thrilled. And I just want to end by just thanking Hillary Clinton for her leadership, not just talking, but walking the talk every step of the way and being there again and again. So thank you. I've written something in it for you.
Thank you. Maria, I want to bring you in here. I mean, didn't I tell you this is a powerhouse panel? A pretty impressive group. So I know your approach to disruption has its roots in restoration and recovery, specifically in Guatemala after a decades-long civil war. And for those unfamiliar with your work, you saw an urgent need for repair and income generation, especially in remote areas. So can you just talk to us about how you've centered infrastructure in your work centering girls and women?
Yes, but first I really also want to acknowledge Secretary Clinton. I mean, we're so proud of you, women all over the world. You are an inspiration. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm of the first women that came to Vital Voices. I came here in like 2005, 2004. And I came with a big dream for my country, a country that had been torn by war and where I was looking at women losing their children because they didn't have $5 to feed them or to take them to a hospital. And I came here like with a big dream, but feeling burdened and feeling lonely in my work. And like everybody said earlier today, the first time we sat at a table with the other 16 mentees and all the Vital Voices women, some of you are here, and you heard our stories, and you supported us, and you believed in us. From then on, I never felt like I was alone in this journey. So I think that's the power of Vital Voices. So yeah, I'm a biologist, but I was in Guatemala, and the women were saying, you know, when you were looking at women burying their children, literally from the war and then from the famine, I would ask them, like, what can we really do that will change your lives? And what they said gave me my to-do. They said, Maria, if you can find sources of income for us, the rest we can do. So I began like wondering how we do that, selling everything. But then, it's been 20 years, it's been 18 years, and we're able to set up a system where we could get women with big dreams in the villages, but very few opportunities to become a formal business. Then we set up the Wakami value chain, which would sell products in the world markets, and many women could go through that and get income. And then the women with income, their dreams were not just to have money. They wanted educated kids, healthy kids, kids that went to school. So then we built a platform where we also have girls' clubs and scholarships and nutrition programs so the women can really get the dreams done. And what have we seen after 18 years? In a country where the average school attendance is 4.5 years, for girls it's even less, the Wakami boys and girls have 9 years of school attendance, double the school attendance coming from the most vulnerable community. And in a place where 50% of children suffer chronic malnutrition, we see that the Wakami women, after 1 year of being in the program, 60% of those children start recovering. So when you look at that, the biggest problems of our country are being solved by women with income. I think, how we were trying to find a name for that, and we were thinking it's like the mom effect. You give mom an opportunity, and she will transform the children in her families. And the dream is you give many women a source of income, and you change a country. And being part of Vital Voices just gives me the ability to believe that we can scale and we can go further. So I think businesses that provide opportunities for very vulnerable people are businesses that change the world, and through moms.
Maria, thank you. As you're talking about infrastructure, Secretary Clinton earlier during lunch, we were talking about how in the world today there's so much conflict, right? We're talking about Sudan, Ukraine. And the reality is that even when infrastructure is built, like when we saw the botched US exit from Afghanistan, the infrastructure can crumble. If you were in the White House today, how would you be handling the crises we're seeing right now?
How much time? Look, I think that there's so much going on. It is hard to really figure out everything that should be done. But just in a very sort of brief overview, I fully support what our government is doing in Ukraine. I want the Ukrainians to win. I want them to push the Russians out of their country. I want them to be able to rebuild the infrastructure that has been deliberately targeted by, Putin. And that will require patience. And, we're not living in a particularly patient time. We have a short attention span. People are wanting, to figure out what's happening, move on, keep going. But we have, I think, along with all of our allies, but mostly because of the courage of the Ukrainian people and their leaders, we have been able to see a small country invaded by a very, very large neighbor defend itself. And I think we should do everything we can to help them continue the fight and go on the offensive and try at least to push the Russian troops out of what has been seized last year, and then try to figure out how we can help them rebuild. In Sudan, the United States government, along with others, have been trying very hard to negotiate ceasefires, but the bloodlust is too high. The men that are fighting for power are not ready for a lasting ceasefire. I mean, one of the things that happened in Northern Ireland after 3,500 or so people were killed, there was enough willingness to stop the killing and to have a ceasefire, but it took years to get there. And
do you expect that with Sudan?
In Sudan, I don't know. I think the two men, the head of the military, the head of the militia, are putting everything they have into trying to gain power, and there's going to be a lot of terrible, barbaric, consequences of that. As we heard at lunch from Nazik, Bashir escaped, so he's at large. We've got other countries in the region that are trying to pick sides and arm the side they're in favor of. We've got the Wagner's army, which is the Russian mercenaries that are fighting in Ukraine. They're also in Africa, and they're also picking sides. So this is going to be, I'm afraid, a very difficult conflict to get to a ceasefire that lasts, but we should keep trying, and we should do everything we can. I want to continue to support the women's revolution in Iran, those young women who are on the streets of Iran. I think they will eventually prevail, but they have paid a huge price. The number of, young people killed, thrown into prisons, tortured, sexually assaulted by a regime that has no legitimacy, a bunch of old men hanging on to power. It's disgusting. And so the people, and particularly the young people of Iran, deserve so much better, and we need to do everything we can, which is difficult, to support them. Afghanistan, look.
Could anything have been done differently for that?
Well, after, Trump made the agreement to pull out, I don't think anything was going to happen other than that we were going to pull out. It could have been handled better. I think everybody should recognize that. But it's really tragic. The Taliban showed up in Doha during these negotiations that, Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State, was leading. And the Taliban said, we're different. We've changed. Oh, of course girls can go to school. Of course, no problem. And if you read the ridiculous document that the United States government under Trump signed with the Taliban, they just bought it hook, line, and sinker because they wanted to get out. And so then Biden inherited that, and it was, a very unfortunate outcome. So we need to do everything we can to try to help the people of Afghanistan, especially the women and children. That's going to be very difficult because, aid is being cut off if women are delivering it. There's lots that we have to figure out how to do to help. So you could literally go around the world. There are so many challenges. But on balance, I think that, the coalition that was put together to help Ukraine was quite an accomplishment. I think the work that's being done to try to bring Asian nations together to stand up against a potential invasion of Taiwan by China, very important. I think that we need to do a lot more work in Africa and Latin America. I don't think that, there was so much, in my view, that wasn't done in the prior administration. We have to do some makeup work there. But we're living in a really complicated time. And we need people to not just be in government and thinking about these issues, but, in business, in the media, citizens, in academia, across the board. Because I know that if we don't stand up for freedom and human rights, we will lose ground. And I don't think we want that to happen.
Yeah. And so I want to end. We got about a minute, so we're going to do rapid fire. Minute with this very small panel of 5 very powerful women. So, Bronagh, I want to start with you. Asking each of you a slightly different question, but for everyone looking ahead. Bronagh, where do you see the greatest opportunity for progress when it comes to how we build coalitions?
Well, one of the things I think we have is we have the international frameworks now with the Beijing Platform for Action and the suite of resolutions around women, peace and security. And the solidarity piece is really important. In the depth of our difficulty, having international solidarity from outside was essential. And moving forward, like a good news story when Vital Voices came to Northern Ireland was when I set up Democracy, we had partnerships which managed to turn very few women in our assembly and in our political infrastructure from 14% up to nearly 40%. We're at 37% now. And that's, I think, turning around the management of power. So where I think it needs to happen along with this is I have a lot of faith in you. In the young people in every single country. And those of us need to work in an intergenerational way, supporting young women because you're really sassy. You don't censor yourself the way we maybe used to do growing up. You have our faith and our love and our hope. And I think we need to create that sense of security around them. And those of us who are in opportunities to make it easier within the international frameworks, we need to be doing that so that they can get ahead and do the work in every country.
Oumie, I want to bring you in and sort of reframe the question a bit. What does progress look like to you? But also, what do you think the West may be doing wrong when it comes to work on the African continent? What can we be doing better?
Okay. To me, progress is about creating adolescent girl leaders, young women as leaders. My commitment from now to 2030 is the creation of 2,000 young women leaders across the Gambia by constructing something similar to this idea called the Leadership Hub for young women in the Gambia. It is through the grant that we got from the Global Fund through Vital Voices Connection, creating women leaders and sharing that power, ensuring that girls and women are represented on the decision-making tables will be transformative to improve maternal health, to reduce food insecurity, sexual violence, domestic violence, and force leaders to enforce laws such as laws against female genital mutilation and child marriage. How the West can invest more is getting our leaders to work for the people and not for their political positions. Help us rebrand democracy in a way that it doesn't also look like something like a force on us, working together with us through our institutions, collaboration between the West and the South to ensure that the gains of democracy over the decades are actually sustained in the best interest of the most vulnerable, but also those people that we see as vulnerable are powerful in their own rights when they get the right investment on them and the space are created for us to voice out our needs and we have the abilities to thrive, and the sky will be the drawing board.
Thank you. Ruchira, you're an Emmy Award-winning storyteller. Looking ahead, how do we tell stories that best serve women and girls as a group here?
I think tell stories of hope, talk about what we have achieved, what our friends have achieved, what each other has achieved, because often we are gaslighted and we are told you've done nothing, you failed, this is going on, that's bad. But actually we have made huge strides, and what we are facing right now is a backlash. So if we don't give up right now, we can achieve a world in which there's full participation of women and girls in everything. Because if not, our democracy will go. Gender digs a trench into our brain into which all other inequalities fall, because it's at home we first realize that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and one to obey, one to get paid for their work and one not. And then we go out replicating the same models of power and looking for a strong head of the state, just like a strong head of the family, who may be right or wrong. So we really have to not give up. We are almost there.
Thank you. Maria, what gives you hope in this moment as you look ahead?
I think we were talking with Elise today, collective dreams. You know, the big gift that Vital Voices, the women here in the US gave us as women, was to learn how much power comes from supporting each other. And that we brought to Guatemala and to Central America. Once I came here, we started with other friends, other women in Guatemala, the Central American Vital Voices Network. And what gives me hope, it's so many of us, women, working with girls, working with generating income, working with getting women on boards. And so it's a movement now, and it all got started here. So the more we are, the faster we will achieve this world in which equality is a key ingredient.
Thank you.
That gives me hope.
And of course, Secretary Clinton, I want to end with you. 2024, no kidding. Where do you think we need to be focusing our efforts when it comes to pursuing a gender equal world, looking forward, looking ahead?
Well, I think you've heard from 4 amazing women who are showing us by their daily actions and their commitments what can and should be done. And honestly, from my perspective, we just have to keep the energy up to continue to stand and speak out and support women and our men who are allies, who are on the front lines, trying to push forward the kind of opportunities and rights and power that women and girls deserve to have in the continuing pursuit of justice and equality. So honestly, I know we've had a backlash. You're 100% right about that. But that should just stiffen our spine and get us more committed. And I think it's important to keep trying to get more allies, more people who understand what's at risk. I was talking to some women who are in the fight for abortion rights in our country, and all of a sudden, somebody knows somebody who has a miscarriage and they can't get treated because under the absurd laws of the state in which they live, they're told, "I'm sorry, we can't treat you yet. Go sit in your car until you're really sick, and then come in, and maybe then we can treat you." Well, storytelling and then acting on those stories and then motivating people, and I'll end with this, and then turning out to vote in democracies and not leaving it to somebody else to decide who our leaders are. That's what we need to be doing if we're going to stop the pushback and restart all the progress that still lies ahead.
Secretary Hillary Clinton and everyone else, thank you all so very much for your work and for your time.